Yeah, Dr. Alexander Cummins is here this evening. Before we get to the program, a couple of housekeeping things. Yes, this is a museum, and there are items of furniture and objects from the 17th and 18th century. So no matter how tactiliously presenting they may be, please don't touch them, don't lean. Don't even give them nasty looks, because when you get to that age, and trust me, I know, you can find it a little offensive. But there you go. Yes, Dr. Alexander Cummins is, as he's mentioned to you, a magical consultant, as a professional diviner as well as a historian of magic. He received his doctorate from the University of Bristol in England, where his thesis explored magical approaches to the passions in early modern magic. As he mentioned, he focused on folklore and sorcery, medicine, divination, grimoires, folk necromancy, which is always fun. And the website is on the cards there, and I urge you all to visit, please, because it's very interesting. He can also be booked, also personally for coaching consults, readings. And just so that you know, his favorite animal is the octopus, who's left its mark. So with that, please welcome Dr. Alexander Cummins.
Thank you. Hello. Oh yeah. Thank you for coming on such a wonderful evening. It's lovely to be back at the Witch House again. I'm always incredibly grateful to get to talk about early modern magic in an early modern building. It's an absolute delight and a real privilege. We're talking about this happy topic this evening, nice wholesome stuff, how to curse your friends, enemies, loved ones, acquaintances, etc. What I'm going to attempt to do is to talk about not just how to do it, but how not to do it, which is to say, we're interested here primarily in a body of ideas called humoral theory, which is actually a wide variety of ideas that we're going to explore, that are around health and well-being, and around how we as individuals interact with each other and the environment, and hopefully how we seek equilibrium in a constantly changing, dynamic world. While these ideas themselves are often ones that have kind of fallen out of favour, I think there's some babies to be rescued with the bathwater that was chucked out with this pre-modern medicine idea. But to start with, it's important for us probably to talk a little bit about satanic fluids. So Reginald Scott, in his highly influential Discovery of Witchcraft, which is one of my favourite books to talk about, and happy to do so in much more detail if necessary, stated that at least most every accusation of, quote, witchcraft and enchantment is the cloak of ignorance, whereas indeed evil humours and not strange words, witches or spirits, are the cause of such diseases. Yet, most early modern people saw little need to separate a disorder into exclusively natural or supernatural causes, as Scott seems to be doing here. The devil and his minions, both demons and wicked sorcerers, and more often sorceresses, could affect, quote, the body of man or beast when he moveth the spirits or humours, whereby diverse and sundry diseases are engendered. Meaning, even a perfectly natural disease could have supernatural and magical dimensions to its cause, severity, and duration. Crucially, these internal mechanics were exactly those governing and augmenting humours, humoral temperaments, as well as emotional experience and expression, and the effects of these expressions, both mundane and magical. So, the Presbyterian Richard Baxter, in his The Certainty of the World of Spirits, published at the end of the 17th century, summed up a concrete demonological as well as abstract theological perspective on the passions and the humours. He said, Satan's advantage from the humours was in their dis-ease and temper, as he can tempt a phlegmatic man to sloth, a choleric man to anger, a sanguine man to lust or sinful pleasure, so he can a melancholy man to despair and self-destruction, and against God. Unsurprisingly, given its association with chthonic darkness, devilish fantasies, and suffering, Baxter considered melancholy in particular as the seat, the bath, and the kingdom of the devil, which lends our talk this evening its name, The Devil's Bath. The Jesuit Thomas Wright, in his The Passions of the Mind in General, to give us a bit of context about this early modern psychology of the emotions, the passions, as they get called before around 1750, has a list of the very first impediments to a virtuous life of the passions being, quote, the suggestions of the devil, and outlines simultaneously theological, cognitive, and humoral affectivities to perception and processing that determined being and acting as an impassioned person. The devil, he said, being a spirit, by secret means can enter into the former part of our brain and there chop and change our imaginations. And I love this notion of him like editing with a pair of scissors our memories to form them into these patterns that make us say, yes, I'm quite right to be really furious about this actually. I think about every time anyone's ever been mean to me. I love this notion that this kind of spirit contact and this kind of influence is less a voice whispering in your ear and more reforming, chopping and changing your own imaginations, right? This idea that the passions begin with perception, and that if our perceptions are altered, so too will our perspective. But our passions are always altering our perspectives. As the angry man lives in an angry world, he speaks angry words which make the world around him angrier. Passions have this contagious quality to them already. The emotions that we're picking up from other people are replicating themselves. We're used to talking about magic from at least Fraser and the Golden Bough onwards. We're used to the idea of sympathetic magic being contagious, but the idea that our thoughts and feelings were also these things that could contain the seeds of various magical ways in which we could be more beastly or more kindly to each other is something that fascinates me. It's just one of these dimensions where I think there's something to this that is really helpful for us even today as we understand something a little more about medicine that doesn't rely on cutting limbs off as often anymore, hopefully, on a good day. So Wright goes on to say that, along with chopping and changing the imagination, the devil can represent pleasures with a goodly show. He can propound virtue as a most bitter object. He can make us slothful in the way of God by stirring the humours, altering the blood, which cause a tedious loathsomeness in us. And I love this idea of a tedious loathsomeness as well. I think it's a fantastic concept. So, probably a brief show of hands at this point. Are we familiar with humoral theory in its broad context at all? Okay, great. So what we're talking about here, as some of you will know, is a notion that probably goes back to, there's a bunch of theorists that go into this, but we're talking mainly ancient Greeks, from at least Empedocles onwards. The idea that good health is the balance of four humours or moistures in the body. These moistures relate to the four classical elements. So we have fiery choler, which can inspire us to boldness, braveness, to be decisive, to enact our will in the world in a helpful way, to be a bright shining light for others, to also get incredibly angry, to get hot-headed, to have boiling blood, to see red. These figurative terms that we have for our emotional states are also ones that were considered deeply literal. Right? Likewise, we have the balance of the phlegmatic humours, the watery humours, that are said to lubricate and allow the organs of the body to function in spite of the dryness and the heat of these choleric passions. So already the humours are attempting to balance each other as well. And the phlegmatic is both dreamy and reflective, having that watery quality of reflexivity, of imagination is considered a very watery concept. Again, because it's existing in a field like nature, of our ideas and our thoughts and images having an effect in the world, as the image of a saint card might, or indeed of a devil that might terrify us. The affectivity of these principles is really important. Likewise, though, phlegmatic could also be considered slothful, to be considered often lazy, and have a preponderance towards both hope and fear, which is to say, living half in the future, right, and considering the projected future of a good or a bad thing to come. The sanguine person was often considered someone with a preponderance of the sanguine humours of the blood, was often considered to be both very balanced, very joyful, very capable of being a good mixer of understanding and interrelating to other people, as the air and as the blood mixed and circulated around the body was a medium by which things could occur. It was also said to be subject to proclivities towards lust. And if we think about the oily, haptic qualities of being seedy or being greasy, these kind of figurative terms of being overly familiar right, are also contained within this idea. Lastly, the melancholy person, someone with a preponderance of black bile, melancholia, was said to be ruled by Saturn and capable of deep cogitation and intensely complicated cogitation, but also prone to sorrow and solitude and depression, what we now call depression. One of the interesting things that we get, and we return again and again to the heart and the importance of the heart in humoral theory, as we'll explore, is that one of the explanations that's given for why sanguine people are so capable of being happy is that they feel their passions intensely and they move through their bodies, passio, to move through, as well as passio, to suffer, right? That they feel their passions intensely, but then no grief sticketh to their hearts, is how Culpeper puts it in Semiotica Uranica, whereas the melancholy person, their heart becomes clogged with these emotions that they will not let go of. And again, I just came back from a conference in Italy talking to psychoanalysts and artists and occultists of various stripes, and there was an awful lot of discussion about this very concept of how we clog our hearts up and how we can allow them to flow more vigorously. So again, hopefully, I hope we're going to see something of how looking at cursing can help us see how we occasionally unconsciously put ourselves in crossed conditions at the very least, and learn something from our ancestors about how to avoid doing such a thing, at least within their own ideas. So let's talk about humoral theory a little more. And next slide. Thank you. Right. So humoral theory formed the central operative European medical model for at least about 1.5 millennia, surviving from ancient Greece well into the early modern period. It was simply one of the most historically embedded, best regarded, and most widely used medical models in the early modern period. It charted typologies of personality and of behavioral proclivities, of emotional expression, and indeed emotional experience. As a historian of the humours, Noga Arica has put it, humoral theory explained most things about a person's character, psychology, medical history, tastes, appearance, and behaviour. It is proper, I think, to consider humoral theory as a magical principle of organisation, for the humours were considered the biological corollaries of the 4 classical elements. And so we turn to Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim and his monumental 3 books of occult philosophy. This is the English translation, translated by one J.F. And here, Uncle Heinrich, as I like to call him, has given us a model of why we would be interested, or why it would be useful to understand health in relation to the 4 humours, right? And the 4 humours and their relation to the 4 elements. The 4 classical elements make up everything in the sublunary world, right? In the natural world. Fire, earth, water, and air are the original grounds of all corporeal things, of which all elementated inferior bodies are compounded. And he goes on to say that these aren't just lumped together, he says heaped together is the translation, but that by combining with each other, by understanding how an element turns into another element, how the heat of the kettle produces the steam from it, that then condenses down into the water again, that this is going on within ourselves, that we are responding differently to different changing scenarios, and that this understanding of dynamism and occasional stasis is really important for understanding health in a wider holistic sense, that we are made of this, we have a corollary being made of the same things that the earth, its plants, animals, weather are also made of, right? This locating us about the locus of influences in the elemental world. As a brief but important note, the sanguine humour was often called blood, right? And this could be used to refer to the actual sanguine humour, which we can think about as like plasma in the blood, as well as to the gross carrier liquid of all humours. And this is why phlebotomy is used so heavily to regulate humours. If you have too much bad blood in you, containing various corrupted humours, you would have a medical procedure where there would be blood let to void these bad humours from you. So you weren't just voiding the sanguine humour, you were voiding a variety of humours. Sanguinity could even on occasion refer to subtle sanguine vapours or even aerial spirits in the body and outside of them. And this is another example of where almost everything prior to Paracelsus and his idea of the archaeos, of the 7 organs in the body, prior to this idea of the notion of organ failure or organ disease, pretty much everything was considered a disease of the blood. blood of some kind, that the blood wouldn't access a certain part of you, and thus it was the blood that had to be treated on the whole. And so blood made up everything. Rarefied forms of blood, the body was considered to change into pretty much every other substance in the body. Mother's milk was considered a rarefied form of blood, as was semen, which, as we'll see in one example a bit later, a seedy example, if you forgive the pun, also highlights this idea of how sanguinity, both in its literally bloody form, was utilised in a variety of contexts, but also located both desire and the frustration of that desire within a wider context. Humoral theory worked with connections between physiological and psychological affectivity in an incorporated and ensouled subject, a mind-body-soul complex of an individual. Right? This is a very odd way of phrasing this, and it's partly because what we need to understand about an awful lot of the practitioners of this kind of magic and of this kind of medicine were operating in a world prior to Descartes convincing most European intellectuals, some down to this day, that they can think without their bodies. Before the mind-body divide becomes this dominant model, right? The idea of what you're thinking affecting how you grow. The idea that bizarrely arcane idea that the food you eat affects how you feel in the world. Imagine that. These kinds of ideas are already being explored through a variety of what get called non-natural principles, which we might address a little bit. And I'm happy to talk more about how we could regulate our humoral bodies and our humoral minds and our humoral souls and spirits. So at least potentially it was said that the passions would distemper the body, could loose the spirits and engender humours and produce diseases, which we should also remember is literally a dis-ease, right? A lack of ease. Moreover, inordinate passion, which was particularly worrisome, was itself a sharp and violent disease, always dangerous and potentially deadly. The idea that heightened passions caused diseases and even death was common wisdom. There are literal records of deaths from the 17th century. John Grant was compiling them, which list broken heart, grief, and a variety of sadnesses as actual causes of death. And this isn't just a euphemism or a figurative sleight of tongue. Next slide. Thank you very much. The elements of the humours were apprehended by occult philosophers and astrologers, crucially, through what are called elemental triplicities, if you're familiar with this concept. So the 12 signs of the zodiac are each given over, each three are given over to an element and indeed a temperament, as they get called. So when we refer to Aries, Leo and Sagittarius as fire signs, this is what we're doing. We're also talking about them as choleric signs, potentially at least. This created a greater degree of specificity of the elements and humours as apprehended through time, right? The humours change as the wheel of the zodiac spins around the world. The wandering stars of the 7 classical planets were also afforded elemental and humoral identities and associations, and added to the nuanced astrological diagnoses of humoral dispositions. And let's bear in mind that astrology was the dominant medical model up until the 17th, 18th centuries, depending on where and who you're asking, simply because it provided the most information. Astrologer physicians were some of the first doctors to keep detailed case records of their clients. Previous to that, the Royal College of Physicians would turn up to your house for a couple £1,000 a day to feed them and their servants, and would mainly observe you. It's pretty much mostly what they did. The dominant question put to doctors was, do I need to start saving for a funeral? Right? The understanding that the medicine of the period was not necessarily terribly effective was well understood by most people. But this is also the techniques that are utilised to understand how passions engender humours, and humours breed passions. That is, how we become impassioned, and how that affects our health and the health of others around us. So such planetary humoralism and humoral planetary magical services survived, fossilised in idiomatic and figurative language to this day. We just touched on that a couple of times. We speak of people as saturnine, right? We speak of them as being mercurial, or even of having a sunny disposition. These are planetary ways of thinking about behaviour and personality. We talk about lunacy, right? The very concept of madness being ruled by the moon. Such humoral theory didn't just set up, these kinds of personality types that we're used to, the melancholy, the phlegmatic, the choleric, and the sanguine. It articulated proclivities to particular experience and expression of passions. And as one 17th century passion theorist phrased this relationship, again, Thomas Wright, the passions engender humours and the humours breed passions. We're talking about habituation here. But angry people, again, don't just live in an angry world, don't just make the world angrier, they get better at getting angry. Because there is this notion that the heart has grooves about the body that it gets very used to. And one of the other terrible things that can happen is when you are thrown out of your habits, what you do when you don't know what to do, what your body does when it doesn't know what to do. Right? It produces a variety of bizarre effects as well. So as we'll see, the chorus or kind of leaky early modern self had an ability to produce such a choleric feedback that it might extend and influence through and beyond the body, through the breath and through the speech of, say, an angry person, for instance, to begin to innovate and galvanize the natural choler of the elementated world around them. Right? That the sad person made their world sadder as well, which is a sad thing, right? And the feedback loop continues. So, what can we say? Let's talk about doctoring a little bit. I think that's the next slide, if you would mind. Thank you so much. So we see the elemental triplicities here, if we're just not familiar with those. So we have the idea of we talked about anger and choleric passions, the yellow bile, the fiery signs, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. And fire here is made of the dryness and the heat, these what they call manifest qualities. And the reason that there are a variety of explanations requiring a bunch of dead Greeks mostly, about how we get to this whole system of elements being made of two manifest qualities. But in short, the broad solution is that what it produces is a description of a world where both change and stability can occur at all. So when our beaker of water is put on top of the Bunsen burner in our lab, in chem lab, and we turn it on, and the heat produces steam. What we're doing here is we're adding fire and its dryness and heat to water, a cold and moist substance, element. And what we're doing is we're combining the manifest qualities of the heat of the fire and the moisture of the water to create the air of steam. Right? The manifest qualities, having two of them, allows for an element to change into another element. Right? But it also doesn't mean all the elements are constantly mixing together to create just sort of beige mess of the cosmos, an undifferentiated, lumpy, mess. Right? It also means that we can't produce something that is simultaneously hot and cold, dry and moist. Right? It allows for a world without these kinds of inherently problematic paradoxes. Right? So we see how what we're doing very often is we are isolating one feature of these called manifest qualities of an element in order to use it to do something. And we'll see later that an awful lot of love magic was built around heating someone up, making them inflamed with passion. So we're using the hot part of fire. Likewise, an awful lot of operations around calming people down were used in terms of cooling them. Operations of combining things were often utilising the moisture of air and water, just as operations to separate things often revolved around the dryness of heat and of earth. Let's have the next slide. Planetary humours. Okay, yes, we talked a little bit about the planets. These aren't exclusive. Certainly any planet could have an influence on any other of the humours, but typically Saturn was considered to rule melancholy under the shadow of Saturn, as is sometimes said. Likewise, Jupiter was said to be a particularly sanguine planet, if we think of both its capacity to enlighten the mind and also the old stories about Zeus and his extramarital conduct. We get kind of both of the qualities of the sanguine humour there. The Sun arguably rules the kind of good version of anger and choler. The noble qualities of it, the sanguine qualities of it, and it is said that Mars rules the melancholy or the destructive sides of choler and anger. Likewise, Venus is said to rule the good qualities of water, of reflexivity, of sensuality, of art itself. The Moon is said to rule the more melancholy qualities of emotional conduct, of sensitivity, of being made to feel a bit mad by our own moods. And then Mercury is regarded variously as unstable or variable. that seems fair. But there's often a concept of Mercury the messenger, who is good with good planets and bad with bad planets, taking on this quality of things, so representing the very quality of changeableness, of responsivity to other influences and planets. This is a beautiful diagram from Thomas Walker's The Optic Glass of the Humours, where it relates the seasons to the humours, to the elements, to particular planets as well. There's actually some typos in this as well, so I'll leave that to you to see if you can spot them. We can return to that if we want. So the next slide. Yeah. So regulation of the humours. I'm going to leave this up here for a bit. These are anthropomorphic personifications of the various humours, and I love them. So pick your favourite. Tag yourself. Regulation of the humours meant paying attention to several factors within the potential control of the patient or client. And these are known, we do get to it, as the Galenic 6 non-natural principles. They're non-natural because they're under the aegis and influence of human activity, right? They're things you can do to regulate yourself. So these involve usually what gets called the regulation of airs, which means both like environmental factors, like where you're hanging around. Are you hanging around, stinking waters and diseased places and leper colonies and things? But it also often covered the heavens, right? The airs of the sky. We're talking literal influence of the star weather, of astrological conditions. The non-natural principles also often included exercise and rest, sleep and waking, food and drink, what gets called repletion and excretion, and the passions themselves. We were meant to regulate how we felt about the world and ourselves and each other in order that we could regulate our bodily health and our minds and indeed our souls. And as we'll see, this kind of regulation is exactly what's messed with in an awful lot of curse work. Right, so what we're doing is we're looking here a little bit, giving you hopefully a bit of context about how it was thought that we could lead a balanced life before we start looking at the unbalanced life. So as humoral medicine and magic relied on the underlying notion of balance, of the equilibrium of the four humours, to underlie good health and proper functioning of the person, each humour, neither over or underworking, could produce a variety of problems. Right? Knowledge of effective principles or techniques for curing could also be employed to curse. If you knew how to balance, you knew how to unbalance potentially. It is, for example, fairly accepted that something considered maleficia, magic that causes harm, often death, could refer to some form of poisoning, right, with a toxin or natural material or bane. But the wrong diet, being one of these non-natural principles, with the right food you eat, could also itself be dangerous. So lascivious, lustful, sanguine humours, not to mention melancholic lovesickness, could be adversely affected by feeding the target lemons. For instance, citron being considered the emblem of love, and crucially, I love this line, of love's delightful pains and painful delights. Again, this is referred to as like an emblematic thinking, and was not simply reifying figurative associations, it was thinking humorally. One handbook of humoral diet illustrates the notion of this capacity of such foods to both curse and cure, listing the use and hurt of the citron. It says, the juice is good sauce to provoke appetite, staying casting, breaketh gross humours, resisteth pestilential fevers, good for the stone, nourisheth not at all. But it says the hurt of it is that it excessively cooleth the stomach, causes choleric passions, leanness, and melancholious humours. It hurteth the aged, the phlegmatic, and those of cold stomachs. Right? So there are concrete things that various foods themselves were thought to do, and this is outside the realm of hemlock being a poison. Anything, as Paracelsus said, could be a poison. It depended only upon the dosage. If even judging that the citron could, if intended to heal or maintain good health, be eaten only for hot weather, youth, and the choleric, it owes to an underlying quality or idea of the balanced opposites of the elements and humours, manifesting fire as hot and dry, water as cold and wet, for instance, as we've looked at. To know how to balance your choleric citron diet was also to know how to unbalance it. So if we look at these passions here, what we start to see is a variety of ways that engagement with the world are framed. So this is the Aquinan passions, so called because they're arguably the product of Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. And what you'll notice is that they're kind of paired, right? And this is because the passions were said to be the actions of the sensitive faculties of the soul. Humans were said to have three faculties of their soul: a nutritive faculty that we shared with plants and animals that dealt with growing and eating and occasionally reproducing as well, depending on who you ask. Then we had the sensitive faculties of the soul, which governed our passions, our perception, our desires, and these were shared with animals, which we'll return to as an idea, because that becomes an incredibly important part of why exactly you would use eye of newt or gall of wolf in your cursing. These are repositories of virtue that we'll talk about in a second. But also humans had a rational faculty of the soul, which is reason up here, which is meant to keep a close eye on all of these beastly passions, right? These animalistic urges of various sorts. But we see that what we deal with in this split between love and hate, desire and horror, joy and grief, hope and despair, boldness and fear, for instance, is the movements of the sensitive faculties of the soul towards that which it perceives as good or virtuous or pleasurable, and away from that which it perceives as harmful or saddening or restrictive in some way. And so what we're dealing with when we talk about cursing work is almost exclusively these negative qualities that we're attempting to produce. And we can produce those by either turning these up or simply turning these down, right? That the balance can be unbalanced very, very easily. You'll also notice that anger has no opposite. That's rather because of a peculiarity of how anger has been considered throughout the kind of Western canon of psychology. Aristotle, I think, says that anger is commensurate to the slight that has caused it. He's talking about righteous anger, of the activist, of one who sees an injustice and is moved to respond to it. Right? That kind of anger, that kind of positive, righteous anger, is moved only as far as something that's gone wrong causes them to be. In contrast, there's also the notion, obviously, that the Stoics get very interested in, of destructive fury that isn't about solving anything, it's about destroying things. And so anger is kind of its own opposite there, and this causes an interesting imbalance of its own. So what I want to talk about are four forms of cursing humorally, or cursing elementally: a fiery curse, a watery curse, an airy curse, and an earthy curse. Right? And I want us to think about how these affect the humours, and how they affect the passions that are kind of linked to the humours. As we talked about, anger is a very choleric sensation. Hope and fear, or hope and despair, very watery. They require an imagination to understand how things might go, what we hope for, what we fear, what we hope will happen and what we hope won't happen, living a little bit in the future there. The sanguine humours of joy and desire, but also horror and grief sometimes. And then the melancholy passions of despair, fear, grief, horror and hatred, all of these guys basically. Melancholy is a late addition to the humours, and thus is the least good of them. They're all pretty bad. Next slide. Okay, so a brief sojourn into the trouble with the humours. The trouble with the humours is that they are all trying to kill us. Every one of these humours, whether it's too fiery or too watery or too airy or too earthy, is trying to destroy us. Right? And I think about this in a form of analogy using the very academic citation system of The Simpsons. Right? There is an episode of The Simpsons where Mr. Burns goes to the doctors and he is told that he has every disease, every single disease, and Smithers is with him, his loyal assistant, and says, well, how is he not dead already then? And the doctor says, this is a very interesting concept. All of your diseases are trying to kill you at once. So if we take all of these little examples of these little funny fellas, they're all different terrible diseases, and this doorway represents the doorway of your health. They're all trying to get in at once, and so none of them can. And so they are perfectly balanced to be unable to do you harm. We call it the Three Stooges syndrome. Mr. Burns says, so I'm invincible. He says, no, you're very sick. You must take absolute care to balance everything you do properly. Invincible, you say? This is a really good analogy of what's going on with the humours. They're all left to their own devices. If we are utterly only imbibing choleric things, we're going to get get sick. If we're only imbibing phlegmatic things, we're going to get sick. If we're only engaging particularly melancholy things, we're going to get sick. But just as they balance each other, they're kind of antidotes for each other. Too much fiery heat will dry us out, but the lubricating qualities of the phlegmatic humours help the body function again properly. Likewise, those can get too slow and cold and moist, and so the hot moisture of air allows things to circulate again without getting too slippery and rise throughout the body. But that itself can get too too head in the clouds. We can float off with too much airy humour, and so the earthy humour balances us back again. But this itself can become incredibly depressing, and so the fiery humour comes in and gives us that spark of life back again. I talked to a Buddhist scholar who talks about the 4 immeasurable principles of loving kindness, joy, equanimity, and another one, loving kindness, which is like treating everything nicely and extending to it the same love you would a kitten, and attempting to extend that to all living beings, right? He said, but that can get very sentimental, and so you have compassion, which is the desire to rectify evil in the world, to see that there is suffering and attempt to do something about it. But that itself can make us feel the weight of the world on us too heavily, and so we consider joy, and joy in the accomplishment of others. But that itself can also lend a kind of saccharine quality that means you don't end up doing anything. And so equanimity is employed as a tool to understand that we will all be worm food one day, and so we must carpe the hell out of that deer. But that itself can be really scary, and so we return to that concept of loving kindness, and as we cycle through these immeasurable principles, we're able to engage with the problems of the world. And I think there's some similarity with your theory here. I don't know, but cross-culturally speaking. So yeah, bear in mind, it's not a daft idea to attempt to use humours to unbalance the humours to make someone unhealthy, because the humours themselves are already trying to do that, bless them. So rather than avoid poisons, we simply have to learn how to transmute all of them at once, and that might require spinning quite a lot of plates. It takes a lot of work to be healthy. So, let's move on to the next slide, please. Right, so the humoral body is shaped by the galenic 6 non-naturals, right? These components one can regulate to help ensure good health, or temperance, as it gets called. The temperament itself is about tempering things, these influences. And these, again, are listed by Mary Floyd Wilson in her excellent article, English Metal. Air, exercise and rest, sleep and waking, food and drink, repletion and excretion, and the passions themselves. And as Wright says, the humours depend upon the heavens, air, sleep and waking, meat and drink, exercise and rest, according to the alterations of these external causes. And we can moderate these, we can regulate these. We can upregulate things that we need more of, we can downregulate things that we need less of. So far so good. Right. So now we've understood how we would doctor them, you can understand how we would doctor them. Next slide, please. So the humoral diet we talked about just briefly there, excessively cooling, which is a problem here. This is Henry Butt's Dry Diet's Dinner, which not only contains these wonderful lists of what various foods are good for and how they can harm us. It also contains a section called Table Talk for each of the foodstuffs, where if you want to entertain people with why strawberries are called strawberries, then you can tell people that kind of thing. It's a wonderful, bizarre work of magical diet. Also his name is Henry Butts, which is pretty great. Next slide, please. Right, so what can we do about these things, magically speaking? Well, the humoral talismans were very often employed. This is a talisman or a sigil for the scribal sign of Cancer. It's a sigil of this sign is made in most pure silver, which is the metal of the moon, as we may know. And in the hour when the sun enters the sign of Cancer, which used to be around the 10th or 11th day of June, when the moon is in a good aspect, crucially, and not afflicted by any evil planets, these figures must be engraven in the hour of the moon. These figures here and here. This is the front and the back of this medallion. Must be engraven in the hour of the moon when she is increasing, that is, when she's waxing, and in the same hour that they must be done and finished, or else the whole labour is in vain. That refers to planetary hours, which I'm happy to talk about as a concept if we need to. But it's a way of timing things. The seal must be applied in the day and the hour of the moon. So we have instructions on how it's made and then how it's used. It must be applied to the patient when the day and hour of the moon which is a Monday, when she's decreasing, and it's said to be, has to be kept and worn very clean, right? The virtue thereof causeth happy journeys. It is very profitable to be worn against the dropsy, which is a silly name for a very terrible disease, and all defects of the body proceeding from moisture and superfluous phlegm. Right? So we start to see the humoral makeup of these things. We use a watery talisman ruled by Cancer, a watery sign, in order to augment the problems that emerge from excessive water and excessive phlegmatic humours. And so what we're seeing here is a way of combining an understanding of astrological timing and materia in order to produce an effect, a planetary effect, and a hygienic one. Very clean. Have next slide, please. Thank you. So, resting choleric face. Alright, so the power of humoral words, right, along with sort of signifying representational image magic of mental images, the idea that not only was, the images we just saw in the previous slide, not only are those magically powerful, like passwords, cheat codes to make the universe do certain things, so too were mental images, right? The images we kept in our minds. Visualization could have power as well. Could, if we sat there meditating or obsessing about our own failures or our jealousies over, someone at work, this too is going to change our behaviour and start to change the world. But so too, there was a sense of the image magic of expressions as well here. And they were predicated on this idea of plethora, of excess, right? So it says, from the common proverb, ex aduntatia cordis os loquitur, from the abundance of the heart the tongue speaketh, right? In other words, if you're brewing these choleric passions in your heart, they're going to come out some way, right? The more we repress, the more they come out sideways, right? As a Glaswegian friend of mine puts it. This is directly doing these kinds of things. We get hot-headed, we get a fiery temper, we get a sharp tongue, we start speaking bitter words or cutting remarks. It's very, very martial, choleric language. We start seeing red or staring daggers or even having boiling blood. The heat of this choleric passion starts to affect the body and the mind and the soul. The expressive, we think about expression as something that is expressed, the passion has to get out somehow. The expressive, as well as the behavioural affectivity of the passions, is founded on the notion of this impassioned mind-body complex, this ensouled self, producing and being subject to inordinate, imbalancing excesses. An impassioned and passionate one simply had to get the words out, right? So facial expressions, especially the eyes, were some of the primary means to read and diagnose impassioned states. But this very readability also made them an excellent means of transferring passions. So this is not only because the countenance, it is said, is the image of the same, passion prompting and enacted by it, but due to the origins of the affections in the soul. For it is said, of course, by the eyes, as by a window, you may look even into the secret corners of the soul, right? That we're getting at something with the eye. What we're talking about here is a version of the evil eye, of course, which you might be very familiar with as a concept. The eyes didn't simply convey meaning, but affectivity, right? An angry look carried an affective seed of anger itself. A magnifying glass could also be a mirror, therefore, and this sense of reflection has deep occult significance, as the looking glass looks both ways. The eyes, it is said, they wonder at a thing, they love it, they desire it, they are bewrayers of love, anger, rage, mercy, revenge. In a word, the eyes are fitted and composed to all affections of the mind, expressing the very image thereof in such a manner. Again, expression here is literal as well as a figurative term. To think of expressions in both behavioural and idiomatic light, malefic, choleric expressions and their dangerous martial qualities are preserved in these kinds of modern idioms. So particular expression while gazing was not only a way to augment magical affective overlooking, it was a way of weaponizing your bad mood and how you could inflict it on someone else. Next slide. Okay, so we're familiar with the idea of the evil eye, right? That it works, and there are at least two main early modern explanations for it. I'm going to concentrate on one that's more common to the British Isles, because the other has all sorts of gender stuff to kind of confuse it. The root notion of the evil eye, in the British Isles at least, is that melancholy people develop bitterness and depression, and that this is expressed, it is kind of vomited out through the eyes, consciously or unconsciously, right? And that when you ask for, when the little old lady down the road asks you for a cup of sugar and you tell her to bugger off, she curses you and this is what's going on. She looks over you. You are overlooked in a very critical way. And then if your best horse then breaks a leg and has to be put down, you're encountering the effects of that curse.
Yeah, just really quickly, this is maybe the fourth or fifth time that you mentioned melancholic as a very negative connotation in this time period.
Mm-hmm.
How did that affect the culture? Because I can only imagine that it might have changed the culture such that melancholic people were made, were forced by society to be maybe or present as less melancholic naturally.
Yeah.
Like, was it like almost like birther style movement where like if somebody was blamed for being born under a melancholic sign, if they were running for office or something
Right.
like that? Or?
Right. So melancholy is it's a quality that actually undergoes this kind of Renaissance. In the Renaissance, the 16th century, the birth of the idea of the tortured artist, for instance, is considered to be a melancholy character. And there's said to be this fad of melancholy, where actually it was kind of popular. It was considered kind of cool to be a romantic poet, being terribly affected by the sorrows of the world, and to write magnificently long proto-emo poetry about it. Right? So far from being like castigated, very often, if you were young and melancholic, we're looking at the precursors to the sorrows of young Werther and all sorts of other ideas that have led to ideas around melancholy being like a pessimistic realism, the idea that the world is crap and that if you're sad about it, you're paying attention. Right? Very, very negative, very, very cynical take on the world, but one that, a Christian theology that said this is a veil of tears that tests us before we get to the gates of heaven actually syncs up with quite nicely very often. Not exclusively Christian, but that was a wide set of medieval ideas that were kind of operationalized in that direction. The crucial element here is age, that we are all considered to get, humanly speaking, to get colder as we enter the winter of our lives, of our old age, and that we all get colder as we get older and get more and dry out and become more melancholy naturally. And that melancholy young people will express that through poetry and art and deep cogitation and being scholars very often. Ficino and Burton, Robert Burton, who writes The Anatomy of Melancholy, had a lot to say about writing about melancholy to avoid feeling melancholic, that scholars are naturally pretty solitary and sad people sometimes, or have the proclivity towards those kinds of things. But it's the already marginalised, it's the already old and already the older women who are marginalised and either directly accused of witchcraft or simply accused of unconsciously replicating the evil eye and voiding these melancholy humours in an unhelpful manner, right? And this is partly where Reginald Scott's discovery of witchcraft comes in, when he says most of your accusations about witchcraft are actually just, confused and lonely old women. And he still said the devil was real. He wasn't an atheist, right? He still, deeply was concerned with the movement of spirit in the world. But his point was that the actual devil is working through these zealot witch finders who are, stringing up and burning women for being able to read and understand what herbs do, right? Which is not an unfair criticism of them. They were paid by the witch, right? You got a number of pennies by how many you could find, and funnily enough, they would find plenty. So it's a really good question, and it hits on a bunch of really foundational stuff in terms of melancholy. They're all bad, right? All the humans are trying to kill us, but the melancholy is easily the worst because the passions and the humours stick in the heart, and thus even humours that weren't themselves terribly negative would spoil and sour and corrupt. Right? Anything could become a melancholy humour if left to sour and decay for long enough within us. Right? And this was often used as an explanation for what we might now call PTSD in soldiers, especially, that they seemed very choleric, but all of a sudden they would become catatonic. And this idea of the fiery humours burnt their humours to a dust, to a blackened melancholia. So it's the root of why so much is written about melancholy, and widespread about it, and arguably why that's the devil's bath more than any other. So I hope we'll get to see that when we get to the melancholy cursing particularly, and we'll see how that fits with mortality itself as well, and the weight of becoming old, and the grave yawning open, trying to pull us in. So I hope that kind of vaguely answers that sort of.
It did, so
Yeah. So one of the things, this is where are we at? So the idea of the evil eye, right? That you could, that if you avoided humors, you could do that consciously or unconsciously, and you could send your hatred, your spite, your anger. You could also send your love. The idea of love at first sight could be a conscious thing that you did, right? Especially if you would already, fallen for someone. You could. It was said that you could operationalize your own wounded blood, and that you could fire that at someone. Right, that you could cultivate a passion and send it through your eyes to someone. The idea of come to bed eyes being a literal thing as well, a very sanguine thing. What these are, collieries, are magical gaze amplifiers. They're essentially magical eyeshadow for sending various humours, the evil eye or other passions through your eyes more effectively. And what they involve, crucially, is utilising the subtle, pure, lucid, airy and unctuous vapour of the blood, right? And therefore fit to make collieries of the like vapours. So what you would do is you would take materials that would exacerbate whatever passion you were trying to send. So say you were trying to fright someone with fear and with your own anger, you would take lots of choleric, fiery things. The gall of a wolf was considered an especially a depository of choleric virtue, right? And again, what this comes from is the idea that animals don't have a rational faculty of their soul, right? They don't have a superego effectively saying, like, don't get too angry about this because the tribe might reject you, right? All of these kinds of notions of a thing bigger than ourselves. No, animals experience the passions that we do because they have a heart and humours, but they don't have any rational faculty of their soul telling them to be sensible and not so animalistic about these kinds of things. And so they're perfect, unadulterated containers of these virtues. The heart of a dove, right, a loving bird associated for so long with Venus, was considered one of the best ingredients you could have in a love potion, right? The gall of a wolf was the gall being we think about talking about like having the gall to do something. That's the seat of the choleric passions of bravery and anger. Using the feet of moles as an old cure for melancholy, because they were considered an underground, saturnine, very melancholic animal. That you could use those virtues of that part of an animal to enact certain things, precisely because they were an unadulterated source of that thing. So, you could cook yourself up, if you were trying to scare your landlord away, for instance. If they're coming around too often, you're feeling frustrated by them. What you could do is you could get really angry about it. You could daub wolf's blood all over yourself. You could open the door and go blah at them, and this was considered to have a magical effect. But what you're doing, we're talking here about the transfer of passions between one person via the eyes, right? And this would balance and unbalance people, funnily enough. And certainly if I had the door opened in my face and someone screamed at me, covered in wolf's blood and looking daggers at me, I would be scared a little bit, if only briefly. This is an explanation for affectivity, right? It's a way of thinking about these things. And I could meditate on this for a while, but let's move on. Let's talk about a phlegmatic curse of some kind. So, next slide, please. Okay, so phlegmatic folk, if you recall, are associated with sloth, is the term that generally gets used, right? However, in order to understand sloth or sluggishness, I think we need to understand that the main proclivities of a phlegmatic are imaginative. That phlegmatic people lose themselves in their imagination, precisely because their imagination is so built around thinking about possible futures, both in terms of what we fear will happen that we don't want to, and what we hope will happen that we do want to. So humours might predispose us to particular experience and expression, but passions begin with perception. Right? The sensitive faculties of the soul respond to a stimulus of some kind, an odious political statement, a gorgeous stranger at a bar, the graveside of a loved one. Fear is a reaction to a projection of an impending harm. As Robert Minus put it, talking about Aquinas, he says, fear involves our being acted upon in the most palpable sense. We experience ourselves at the mercy of a future evil. And though the evil is in the future, Aquinas acknowledges that something of that evil must be present, like now, in some sense, in order to activate a passion. What are we responding to? What we're responding to is the evil present to the imagination, what Aquinas says, according to the apprehension of the soul. We are making ourselves afraid. We are creating a projection in our imagination, a mental image that we are becoming afraid of. We are the source of the very stimulus that we are responding to, right? And this is true of hope as well. So Aquinas distinguishes between a bunch of different kinds of fear. And I think maybe we'll talk about that in the next slide, or the next one. Yeah, so here's Aquinas, what a looker. And he says that there are a bunch of different kinds of them. There's what gets translated as sloth or sluggishness. There's what gets translated as shamefacedness, blushing, military, red-facedness. There's shame, astonishment, stupefaction, and anxiety. But these are all way more complicated than simply, oh, phlegmatic people are lazy, right? Segnites, sloth or sluggishness, is a passion of one who, quote, runs away from work because he fears excessive hardship. This isn't simply a physiological effect on the body. It's not simply disinclination to work. It denotes the feeling of anxiety experienced by anyone confronted by an unavoidable labour that surpasses your inclination. Minor goes on to give the example of the dread of a university faculty member who has never desired to write for publication because he has nothing to say, but suddenly finds himself obliged to do so. Right, very academic example there. Sloth, he says, at heart is a fear of our incapacities. Other typical phlegmatic condition is shamefacedness, not simply a description of a somatic symptom of literally blushing, but is a fear of what others think of us, a fear of a disgrace that wounds our reputation. It is a fear of others' responses to our incapacities. These kinds of fear associated with phlegmatic passions and humours are self-generated and self-regarding. They concern anxious reflexivity and the negative repercussions of self-doubt. They're terrible consequences of the apprehended sense object provoking our passions, being ourselves. In the case of Verecundia and Erubescentia, both are caused by the perception of one's own actions as an arduous evil. Both are reckoned species of fear. And each of the first three species of fear arises from perception of the self rather than anything outside of the self. This is especially true of shame. And Minor quotes R.G. Collingwood when he says, what a person is ashamed of always at bottom is themselves, and what they are ashamed of themselves at bottom is always for being afraid. And thus we come, hopefully, I presume, to a better understanding of a particular talismanic image. And that's the next slide, I think. This is not the talismanic image. It's a picture by Picasso. It's the Weeping Woman. I didn't think it fair to include an image of a thing that was meant to cause harm. So I decided to use that instead. Right? But we have a description of it. Hopefully that's a mediated point between it. Agrippa gives this description. In the second phase of Sagittarius, so there is a division of the zodiac, not simply between the 12 signs of 30 degrees, each of the 360 degrees of the band of the zodiac, but each of those 30-degree signs has 10-degree faces, or decans, within them. So in the second phase of Sagittarius, it is said one could build an image of a woman weeping and covered with clothes. And the operation of this is for the sadness and fear of his own body. Right? This is a phlegmatic curse from a fiery sign, bear in mind. So we're using fire to augment or destroy or otherwise negatively affect something watery. Right? We're employing opposites here to unbalance someone, to make them afraid of themselves, to make them fear their own body. And this is the technical dimensions of this are pretty impressive in some ways, right? Wherever you go, there you are, right? Not simply cursing them to be harmed by something external, but to cause their own harm, to cause their own unwellness, their own disease, their own distemper. Horrible. Very effective as cursing, to disease the imagination, right? To infect the target virus-like, to turn the victim into the cause and even generator of their own torment. Yeah, nasty stuff. Again, partly why I didn't include the image of them. Have a nice Picasso picture instead. There we go. From the phlegmatic to the sanguine. Let's talk about a very brief example here. The next slide, if you would mind. Thank you. So, sanguine love curse, which we get from Julian Goodare in the article Men and the Witch Hunt in Scotland, in Witchcraft and Masculinities in Early Modern Europe. So another form of preparation are love apples, which are evident from one Scottish account of one David Roy, who in 1601 attempted to use a love charm on his employer's daughter by the daubing of an apple and the infusing of a portion of his own nature, which is a fancy term for semen, in it, right? And you thought dick pics were bad. The idea here, as we should understand, along with the discomfort of this being a really gross thing to do in general, is that you are attempting to infuse something into a thing that the literal target of your affection is going to consume. So the magical link is clear, and we remember that sexual fluids are considered to be rarefied forms of blood as well. What we're doing is the sanguinity of this operation is really key. That you are attempting, that he's presumably infatuated by his employer's daughter, and so the notion of a lot of these love curses, and they are love curses, they're referred to as erotic malefic workings, is that you are attempting to weaponize your own sense of both entitlement and attraction to someone, and attempting to put something of why you like them into them so that they like you. It's a very odd concept, and one that requires us to understand this intense, bizarre affectivity of the curse also creating a magical link, which is also why witch bottles were utilised, that you could utilise the link of someone cursing you to curse them back, that the best defence was often a good offence. It's also worth pointing out that this operation might highlight something of the way that love magic was also a resort of people in class conflict, right? It's his employer's daughter, right? There's a huge fear that Goodare and various other people write about of the fear of women, of wives leaving their patriarchal husbands and running off with the help, right? Running off with the hot young boy toy of an apprentice, right? The idea that the social order could be so upended by love cursing, and that's where love magic becomes cursing and not good solid stuff. Is whether it supports a nice solid patriarchal model of a good solid nuclear family, or if it upends it and gives, particularly if it gives women any agency, right, or poor people agency. And in an era where who you married and who you had kids with was directly affected by primogeniture, by whether or not you inherited wealth, this is important stuff. That's why love cursing is one of the most frequent claims in aristocratic courts that people are doing, and this is used as a self-appointed finger to get rid of people, right? The dimensions of the political and economic and social dimensions of love magic and love cursing have huge implications beyond like witchcraft, right? And speak of how we formulate desire in societies and how we relate to each other. In one cunning man's working book, there are 8, which is Sloane 38 manuscript 3851. There are 18 different love spells contained involving apples alone. Right, various things that you do with apples. None of them quite this intimate, shall we say, but carving things onto the apple, getting someone to eat the apple, getting someone to touch the apple, touching someone with the apple, writing things on your hand when you pick the apple, calling the apple the same apple that tempted Eve in the garden, right? These things are not, highlight this sense of very Christian and also thoroughly not Christian magic. Again, this fascinating interplay between what we want and what we think we should want is, I think, really interesting, as well as occasionally being delightfully obscene. Yeah, we can meditate on love and love magic a lot. It's a particularly fascinating area, but I think it's a particularly good example of how sanguinity could be weaponized in various forms. So finally, let's talk briefly about melancholy curse. So, the thing to bear in mind about melancholy, and this is Melancholia by Dürer, as we'll remember, there's a seal of, it's actually a number square of Jupiter here, right? So It's, all of these things are meant to be very saturnine, but we should bear in mind that he's also trying to cure himself. The good sanguine Jupiterian connection is attempting to be utilised to rebalance his humours, right? It is, I think, useful for us to think about earthy humours as literally like dirty, as like soiled in some way, as unpleasant, as stained, right? And there is, again, this quality, this kind of vaguely pseudo-gnostic quality of like the earth and the material and the body are to be rejected, and the soul and the eternal and the mind are to be exemplified and exalted. And this comes across very heavily when we start thinking about how melancholy is also associated with darkness, and the trouble of darkness, not simply as the unknown, but as the ignorant and as the quenching of light. Right? We have the notion of melancholy humours being those that have been burnt to a dust. They are corrupted humours. Any humour that is felt too intensely or for too long can become a melancholy of some sort. Likewise, we have the root notion that a passion, that something that moves us because it's inevitably an imbalance of some sort. And as an imbalance, it's inevitably creating some kind of suffering. It might not feel like a suffering when we're excited about something, but that excitement can only lead to either fulfillment or disappointment, and either way it ends, right? It's a very cynical take on things. But we also have this idea that melancholy emerges simply from pain, that anything that pains us and anything that pains other people around us produces melancholy. There are plenty of ways in which it is particularly distrusted and feared, as well as being capable of producing deep cogitation and the profound boundaries of epistemological endeavours of thinking about thinking about thinking. Next slide. So what I want to get at here is that melancholy itself, if you encouraged it, it would create its own curse. That's what I want to get at here. There are plenty of things that can cause you to be haunted or possessed, but just making someone melancholy could make themselves put into this very negative situation. Black collar melancholia, after all, which is so obstinate and terrible a thing that the violence of it is said by physicians and natural philosophers, besides madness, which it doth also induce. This is something that Robert Burton in his Anatomy of Melancholy has a lot to say about, how melancholy produces madness and madness produces melancholy, and they are kind of like engaged in this vicious cycle between each other. Not only that, but it also entices evil spirits to seize upon men's bodies, and especially women's bodies as well. So great also, they say, the power of melancholy is of, that by its force celestial spirits also are sometimes drawn into men's bodies. There is this gravity of the grave, that the heavy interior darkness of melancholy like a black hole in our heart, pulls spirits into it. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but intensely so. And this is given as an explanation as to why why those undergoing depressive episodes are anhedonic, for instance. They have trouble feeling the things that used to excite them or give them pleasure, precisely because their heart is full of spirits that are writhing about and arguing with each other. Not all negative either. Some celestial spirits too are drawn in. The hopes that the heart becomes this battleground, and the gravity of the grave pulls them in. And this is the difficulty of melancholy. It itself is kind of a curse. The final slides. Thank you. So there's a great example here of a melancholy distemper, and this was found. So we have examples of these. So familiar with number squares? Planetary seals. This, just as this is a representation of a spirit, this is a representation of what Venus does, just done in numbers rather than in pictures or images. And this is a map of how we get. This is actually drawn. These numbers are letters as well, and we can use this in a kind of cryptographic way to encode or decrypt various bits and pieces. So these numbers are said to represent Venus abstractly as well. And if you made this, it was said if you engraved this on a silver plate when Venus was in a good place in the heavens, it conducive to cure all melancholy distempers and causeth joyfulness. Being carried by travellers makes them fortunate. But the other thing you could do with these cameos is that you could make them, these number squares, is you could make them when Venus was unfortunate. You could make a reverse version of it for cursing. So just as Venus with its joy and its sweetness of life and its sensuality and its loving nature could be corrupted itself, could be reversed. If it's formed upon brass with an unfortunate Venus, it causeth contrary things to all that has been said above. So it causes melancholy distempers and cures or prevents joyfulness. Right? So we have this notion of the thing that can heal us if we use it at the wrong time, when Venus is in an unfortunate place, and also, or in a different material, can also be used to harm us. I think, is there another example here? Yeah. So these cameos could also be done with various others. So if you engrave a Mars talisman when it's unfortunate on a plate of red brass, it hinders buildings, casts down the powerful dignities, honours, enriches and causes discord, strife, and the hatred of men and beasts, and chases away bees, pigeons, and fish, and hinders mills, and renders the unfortunate that go forth to hunting or fighting, and causeth barrenness in men and women and other animals, and strikes terror in all enemies, and compels them to submit. So, there's a lot to say here. The natural world is present here, as well as like people's feelings, though those are also important in the hatred of people. It literally causes barrenness and strikes terror into enemies when it's being placed in an unfortunate position. Do we have one more example of these? No. What I want to get at here is that all of these bodily humours are elementated moistures of some kind. All of these ingredients, which are often included in cursing work of various sorts, are themselves based around bodily fluids, and those bodily fluids are themselves humour. Hello.
For the Mars cameo, was that Hebrew script, and if so, how does this relate to Kabbalah as well?
Oh sure, yeah, do you want to flip back to one? Yes, so this is the number square of Mars, which is 5 by 5. It's 5 is the Marshall number, Kabbalistically speaking. We go from Ein Sof, Ur, nothing but another's light, to Keter, the first sphere, premium mobile, to Chokhmah, the universal wisdom or masculine principle, to Bina, the third, which is related to Saturn, and the Amma and Amma, the barren and fertile mothers, and the notion of understanding. That then filters down through the veil of Paraketh, or sometimes it's referred to as the abyss, as the fourth sphere, which is Chesed, loving kindness, or mercy occasionally. And then we get to the fifth sphere, which is number 5, which is Geburah, which is sometimes also called Pachad or Din, variously severity, fear, and awe or power. And so the fifth sphere of Geburah is considered to be the sphere of Mars. And so it's directly Kabbalah of sorts. Crucially, it's Christianized Kabbalah. We get 3 kinds of Kabbalah generally. You get the K, the Kabbalah, which is a Jewish cosmogony, how we get from God to the world and benches and jam and things in the sphere of Malkut, the kingdom of the senses. Then we get Christianized Kabbalah coming around in the Renaissance period, exactly this kind of period that Agrippa's super invested in. These are all taken from the 3 books of occult philosophy as well, which is spelled with a C usually for help. And that's a bunch of Christians taking some of this Jewish map of how a cosmology map, a creation map of God to the world, and seeing can we climb it back up to God? Can we achieve union, a theurgic mysticism with God? So authors like Pico della Mirandola, Marsilio Ficino, and others writing. And Agrippa himself, arguably one of the things that makes the 3 books of occult philosophy so useful and fascinating is that it is, on the one hand, it is an encyclopedic rundown of all the Greco-Roman magic stuff that's present in Renaissance Europe. But the other half of it is that he's syncretizing a new form of a Kabbalistic formula of the name of Jesus. So he's using old Kabbalah in a new way to say, it's pretty appropriative when you talk to like Kabbalistic scholars, right? But it's what they're doing, right? Christians have been ripping off like Jewish mysticism for a hot minute now. Right? I don't think that's terribly controversial to say. So, I mean, literally what these are is, at this point Hebrew was still using letters for numbers as well. So these are literally a translation of these numbers into here, is the short answer. But what was also being done is a lot of these seals are generated by spelling the name of the spirit of the planet out using the letters that are also numbers. So that's how. This is totally Kabbalah, just a very Christianized form. Yeah. So the main thing I want to get at is that there are formulas where you spit in a bag and use that way, particularly where you'd say a prayer and then with saliva and then spit into a bag, that you were keeping the prayer in some way. It trapped in the saliva. Sweat itself, doing something laboriously. Tears are especially thought to be phlegmatic, salty water that's coming out of your face, right? This older Greek notion that the heart is the seat of thinking and consciousness, and the brain is mainly there as this soupy electric mess to cool the blood, right? This is again why the phlegmatic, that phlegm, like when you have a cold, it comes out of your face, right? This is again very figurative, daft stuff to us that has this basis for itself. And then obviously the great witchcrafts that are done with milk, semen and blood, whether that's menstrual, violently spilled, or of the dead, are all very important ingredients that are used in a variety of cursings and healings occasionally as well. And what I want to get at here is that humoral theory isn't just about someone saying, "Oh, you're too sanguine and you have to be more, you have to temper that with some melancholic humours." It's that this is already going on, present in the cosmology of the body and how it interrelates with its environment and each other. So this is a vastly underlying feature here of many of these the spells that won't expressly talk about their humoral nature, but are using those as underlying explanations and assumptions about the operation and organisation of a naturally magical organic cosmos. So we've got a final slide. The heart of the matter, right? Core, it's a nice French pun there, which fortunately works. Study of the practical functions and uses of humoral theory was put to curse as well as to cure, and offers plenty of instances of the intersection of two fascinating and relatively nascent fields, material history and emotion history, and such new lenses on old occult philosophy and magical activities foreground a fresh set of lessons to offer us about how our ancestors spoke in the language of the elements and the stars in order to better apprehend their places in the world. And cursing especially, I hope, offers some highlights on how such schema of interrelation, affect and occult virtue could be operationalised and kind of weaponised. And this was especially present in the heart, which was the seat of the passions, the shaper of the humours, and underlie most of the features that we're talking about today. It was the core of our being. It was regarded by Aristotle onwards, in a pun that works in ancient Greek as well as in English, as the heart is the hearthstone of the body. It is the basis of our life. And this is because the heart is said to be the place of radical heat and moisture. When Descartes said that the difference between a live body and a dead body is that a live body is warm, he's not just being facetious or creepy, right? What he's saying is that it is the heat of us that gives us life and motion, right? We would say that a body is warm because it's alive. Pre-modern people would say a body is alive because it is warm, right? The movement and the motion of heat, the fundamental radical heat, the root heat of life is itself this life spark that keeps us going. And that's where the heart is, and that's where the passion is. The heart is an organ that never stops working, right? The size of a fist. It is the seat of the humours. It is the place that the spirits of the humours were prosecuted about the body, right? When we talk about people being big-hearted or small-hearted or warm-hearted or cold-hearted, these again are humoral, elemental concepts of what's going on when we're feeling and thinking about feeling. Finally, it's the shaper of the passions themselves, that as the heart responds to our passions, so our passions respond to our heart. Just as the microcosm of the person was reflected in the macrocosm of the stars, so too was the macrocosm of the person reflected in the microcosm of the heart. It is said that a fearful person trembles and their heart trembles as well. And we are mirroring each other. The heart is the tiny person in you, not the homunculus in the head that's driving you, right? Like that little alien in Men in Black. Right? That this is how we're in the world. The heart is the heart of us. And that this is why there are so many curse spells based around stabbing pins into hearts of animals and of people, of constructing wax hearts and burning them over things, of melting someone's heart, of these qualities, of working the very core of ourselves and how we relate to each other. So the main points I'd like to make of this kind of brief study about the elementated context of the porous and dynamic early modern self is that the imagination itself, which in the Renaissance period itself was coming under scrutiny as a kind of a philosophy of doubt starts to emerge, this idea that what we see might not be what's real. And as this happens, it becomes cohering around these phenomenological responses as a response itself to the rise of empiricism, of attempting to measure things. It was felt to both receive and transmit environmental influences of a naturally magical cosmos. So your susceptibility was expressly considered in terms of magical contagion, as we talked about before. It was thought that you could catch someone else's nightmares if you weren't careful. Certainly then exposure to the stars as they travel and pulsed through points of particular strengths and debilitating weaknesses through the heavens reflected our own engagements in the world and with each other, as we felt good on some days and bad on other days, depending on how much sleep we got, what the weather was like, whether we'd had an argument with our beloved. You know, these kinds of factors played into our understanding of ourselves and the cosmos, and were thought to be told by those as well, that the universe was narrating itself to itself via us. Once we apprehend this, the humoral identities and effects afforded all worldly things, food and drink, certain places, particular accents and gestures, they began to present their magical utilities and meanings more fully. Any food could be given to cure or harm someone depending on our understanding of what they were going through at that time and what they needed. Cursing is an aspect of how magical practitioners navigated engagements and interrelations with the world and themselves, and hopefully has lessons for us beyond those of how to screw each other over. That's the final slide. So yeah, elementated context, porous, dynamic self, the imagination, and healing and harming. And these are themes I'd like you to take home. That's the homework. Think about these concepts and think about how we can utilize them more fully to be more present as ourselves, to be more present in the world and understand its engagements and interrelations, to understand how we are leaky ourselves, how our own thoughts, feelings and passions have this ripple out effect on each other, how our imagination helps inform what's capable of being conceived of as possible, right? How we can use the techniques of harming to also heal ourselves and each other. So thank you very much. I think that's my final slide. There's one more. You can find me on my website there, or you can drop me an email. Funnily enough, no one had taken Consultant Sorcerer. Snap that one up. And I also have a Tumblr, because I'm cool, which is it's mainly an archive of scans, full scans of early modern sources of a variety of works on medicine, magic, and a bit of religion stuff, but loads of sorcery. And so things like Henry Butt's Diet's Dry Dinner is on. It should be on there, I think. Certainly, Thomas Wright's Passions of the Mind in General is on there. 3 books of occult philosophy are absolutely on there. So if you want to look into more of these sources, you can check out that. And you should all have cards that I've given out as well. And so yeah, you can find those books and read through these sources yourselves. I think it's very important that we make these kind of materials accessible to people that are interested. If you want to talk to me about them or ask any further questions, more than happy to take them at my Gmail. If you're interested in more talks and things that I do a lot of stuff online. We have a mailing list off the website as well as ramblings about a variety of magics and things of that nature as well. So again, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, my glamorous assistant for my slides, personing those so expertly. Thank you all for your time and attention.